Imagine creating something so powerful it could end all wars. But then you realize you might have just handed humanity the tool to end itself. That's really the story here. That was the triumph and the tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. This is a man whose mind literally reshaped our world. And well, he was forever haunted by what he unleashed. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Just let that sink in for a second. These are the words that Oppenheimer himself said echoed in his mind as he watched that first atomic explosion. He was actually quoting the Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu scripture. And it's just this chilling acknowledgement of the awful power he knew he had just set loose on the world. And this is the central paradox of his entire life, right? How could one guy be both a national hero, he was on the cover of magazines for winning the war, and at the same time, a suspected enemy of the state, a security risk who was targeted and basically exiled from the very world of power he helped build? It just doesn't add up. Okay, so to understand this massive contradiction, we've got to start right at the climax of his scientific career. We're going to that moment in the New Mexico desert, the one that forever gave him that famous title, Father of the Atomic Bomb. Yeah, let's forget the legend for just a second and really focus on the man in that moment. Can you even imagine the pressure? Eyewitnesses said he was so tense he was barely breathing, just holding onto a post to keep himself steady. And then, when that mushroom cloud finally shot up into the sky, his first words, they were about horror or even pride. It was just this simple, massive sense of relief. All he said was, I guess it worked. The physicist in him had won. The man, well, he'd have to deal with the consequences later. So who was this guy before he became this huge symbol? Let's rewind a bit and see what went into the making of this brilliant and, often deeply troubled mind. His mind just moved at a totally different speed from everyone else. He absolutely devoured Harvard, finished in just 3 years. And get this, he earned his doctorate by age 23 from a top university in Germany. This put him right at the center of the quantum revolution. He wasn't just smart, he was a genuine prodigy, really operating on a whole other level. But, that kind of brilliance often comes with a dark side. And for him, it really did. He was plagued by depression and anxiety pretty much his whole life. This quote he said to his brother, wow, it just reveals so much. He saw physics not just as a job, but as a lifeline, something he absolutely needed. And yeah, he could be arrogant, he could be difficult, and his personal relationships were, let's just say, they were often a mess. And here's something that's absolutely crucial to understand. Even if you take the Manhattan Project completely out of the picture, Oppenheimer would still be a legend in physics. No question. He did foundational work in quantum mechanics, sure, but his papers on gravitational collapse, they were just visionary. We're talking about him predicting these cosmic objects so dense that not even light could escape. Yep, black holes. And he was doing this decades before we had any way to actually prove they existed. So all of this pure theoretical brilliance, it actually made him a really unlikely candidate for what was about to happen next. Think about it. He had zero management experience. None. And yet he's the one who gets tapped to lead the most ambitious and most secret project of the entire war, the Manhattan Project. And let me tell you, this choice was a huge gamble. Oppenheimer had passed communist associations. People thought he was totally impractical, just an egghead. But General Leslie Groves, he saw something that other people missed. He saw this overweening ambition, as he called it. Groves literally bet that this intense ambition would be the engine that would drive the whole project to success. And you know what? He was absolutely right. And just look at the sheer scale of the task he was given. We're talking over 6,000 people by 1945. He didn't just have to solve the physics, which was hard enough. He had to build a secret city from scratch out in the desert, and then manage thousands of brilliant and, let's be honest, often competing egos. It was a totally unprecedented organizational challenge. And somehow, this theorist, he totally crushed it. Now, the scientific problem itself was just immense. Pretty early on, they figured out that the plutonium they were making in the reactors just wouldn't work in a simple gun-type bomb. Big problem. So under Oppenheimer's leadership, the entire lab at Los Alamos had to invent a radically new and way more complex method called implosion. And they had to do this while they were still perfecting the uranium bomb. So they were essentially building two completely different weapons at the exact same time. The pressure was unreal. And then victory came. The war ended and Oppenheimer was a national hero. But this is right where the triumph really starts to curdle into tragedy. The man who built the weapon was about to become a prophet of doom. It was just a few months after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He gets a meeting with President Truman, and he says this now famous line. The weight of what he'd created was just crushing him. And Truman? Oh, he was furious. He famously told an aide, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again." That right there, that's the moment Oppenheimer goes from being the ultimate insider to an outsider. So in his new government role, he decided to take a stand. He was convinced that building the next weapon, the hydrogen bomb, would just kick off a catastrophic arms race. So he used all of his considerable influence to argue against it. And that decision, it put him on a collision course with some very powerful people in the military and in Washington. And that opposition, it led directly to this, a security hearing that wasn't really designed to investigate anything. It was designed to destroy his career and completely silence his voice. Which brings us to the central question of his downfall, right? How does this even happen? How do you go from hero to zero so fast? Well, the answer is a pretty toxic cocktail of politics, paranoia, and, personal revenge. Okay, so on one side, you've got Oppenheimer, and he's arguing for caution, for international arms control. But on the other side, you have the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War. Any talk of transparency sounded like you were weak, or even worse, like you were a subversive. So his old associations with communists, they were dug up and totally weaponized against him. And he had powerful enemies, like Louis Strauss, a man Oppenheimer had once publicly humiliated, who were just waiting to set the stage for a takedown. But maybe the most painful blow came from a fellow physicist, Edward Teller, the guy known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. Now, Teller didn't call him a traitor, not outright. Instead, he delivered this carefully worded character assassination. He basically suggested Oppenheimer was erratic and just couldn't be trusted. It was absolutely devastating. And the outcome? It was just a calculated humiliation. The board found zero evidence of disloyalty, but they revoked his security clearance anyway. The message couldn't have been clearer. The father of the atomic bomb was no longer trusted with the nation's nuclear secrets. He was, officially, an outcast. So what happened to him then? Well, stripped of all his political influence, Oppenheimer's final years were really spent in reflection. And his legacy, it began this long, slow process of rehabilitation. You know, they say the arc of history bends towards justice, and it did here, eventually. But as you can see, it was a very long road. In 1963, there was a kind of symbolic reconciliation when he got the Enrico Fermi Award. But it took almost 70 years, all the way until 2022, for the U.S. government to finally, formally admit that the 1954 hearing was a flawed process and vacate the whole decision. So in his final years, he basically retreated to a more academic life, writing and lecturing. And for the scientific community, he became a powerful symbol. He was seen as this brilliant mind who was martyred by the political paranoia of the McCarthy era, a really stark cautionary tale about the complicated and often dangerous relationship between science and the state. And that brings us right back to the central question, doesn't it? Scientist, visionary, victim, tragic hero, what is he? The truth is, he was all of those things at once. Here was a man who gave humanity the power to literally destroy itself, and then spent the rest of his life fighting to control that very power. His life, in the end, is kind of a mirror, one that reflects our own highest ambitions and our deepest fears about what we're all capable of creating.